So today we're going to talk a little bit about planting herbs and what you can do and how you can do them in a really beautiful and attractive way that might be a little bit different than what you typically do. So one of the things that we love to do with the way that we garden is we garden all organically, and we plant in a way in which we incorporate flowers, herbs, and fruits and vegetables into everything that we try to do. But with that in mind, herb planters together are a really amazing gift. They're also great for tables. So like this is one that typically will sit on my table outside in my garden, and it's easy for us to use for harvesting. I can just go outside and grab things. These are what we would consider like an entryway planter. So they're just a unique option instead of just having flowers or something ornamental. These are really attractive. Then again, some great delicious herbs are super handy right outside my front door if I need to go get something for dinner. And so I like to make a variety of interesting things. We also, our trellis vendor makes these hanging orbs in a variety of sizes and styles. And so to add some beauty to them, we actually just fill them with put a Coca-Cola liner in them, wrap them with solar lights. That's what this little panel is, and then fill this. And so this is something that you can hang from a patio or a pergola, or in my case, I have a really large established crepe myrtle in our front yard, and we hang several of them from the crepe myrtle, and it just looks really magical. And then they actually come on and then go come on at dusk and then go off in the morning. So we have some in the back. So we order them from our trellis supplier specifically. So one of the things I wanted to talk about today is when we think about making an herb planter, is I like to think of herbs in two ways. I like to think of them as tender herbs and then what we consider are hardy herbs. And your hardy herbs are going to be things that typically get woody over a longer period of time. So you're thinking like your thyme, your rosemary, your lavender, bay, oregano, things like that, right? Your thyme and stuff. So those are what we consider hardy herbs. These are also typically perennial options, whereas your tender herbs, with the exception of chives and a couple other things in our climate specifically, are more annuals, right? So you'll need to replace them at least every couple of seasons. And so we talk through the difference between tender and hardy herbs specifically because they have different watering needs. And so we like to recommend people plant like with like, which means if you're going to make an herb planter specifically, you would plant your hardier herbs together because they have similar water and nutritional needs. Whereas your tender herbs, which typically need a lot more water, then are not getting overwatered, and you're not underwater, they're not getting over or underwatered, if that makes sense. Everything gets kind of exactly what they need. With that in mind, then we also would recommend planting them in a way that, again, kind of fills the space of your container appropriately. So in this example, I planted a lot of very young plants. And to keep this compact, I would recommend pruning your herbs every week. And to do that, what we do is we recommend to clients pruning, when you prune your herbs, to try to prune no more than 30% of the plant, right? 30%, so like a third of the plant, right? What that does is it helps eliminate shock to your plant, but it also is just enough to really encourage your plant to keep growing. And so we do that, that kind of a third rule is really helpful because it's probably about the amount that you need for a recipe or anything like that. And then by also having lots of options, you're not over pruning anything, right? So in my case, my favorite herb is thyme. I have thyme planted all over our garden, but it's easy for me to just go from plant to plant to plant to utilize it regularly in my cooking without damaging, harvest or over harvesting any of the plants specifically, because I love it so much. So that is one of the reasons why we plant a lot of things, and that's how we're able to kind of keep them more compact. And then at a certain point, these plants may actually just naturally start getting too large for this container. And so then at that point, I'll replant this with younger plants, and I'll move these into my garden or into my landscape so that they actually have an opportunity to kind of grow to their full size. So let's dive into one of the planters. So we're going to start with this 10-inch one. And this is a great size. It's got good depth for herbs because they don't necessarily need a lot of depth when they're this size, but you do want to make sure that you have enough depth to be able to have the roots be successful. So we always recommend, what's most important when picking a pot is the actual depth size for the roots. I did one easy thing, and actually we have a couple of things here. So one thing you can do is when they have good sized drainage, we always want to select a pot that has drainage, whether it's for herbs or anything. You always want to have a drainage hole. Because these can be somewhat large, it's really easy to use a recycled piece of paper to fold it up a couple of times and put it in the bottom. You can use a healthy stack of coffee filters, or I really love these little screens that you can also put in the bottom, which help deter other pests and things from kind of coming in here. And Orange County Farm supplies these. And so you can just put those in and cover your hole, and then it makes it easy for you to not have a bunch of soil and or extra water come out right away. So for this large one, this is a great size vessel to use for your hardy herbs. And so I brought just a selection of different hardy herbs, and I always recommend, our growing philosophy at Heirloom Potager is to grow what you love and eat what you grow. And it sounds really simple, but we get asked a lot of times by people asking us, what's the easiest plant to grow? And my response is always the one you love to eat. Because if you think about it, the one that you want to eat is the one that you want to you're going to make sure you take care of, right? So if you love tomatoes, or you love thyme, or you love rosemary, that's the plant that you're going to take care of the most because you love it the most. So for us, it's really about growing the things that you want to grow, not necessarily just because they're kind of easier to grow, if that makes sense. So for us, one of my favorite things to do, especially with the upcoming season, I think you can never go wrong with having enough rosemary. I would also say a sage, and there's a couple different varieties that they have here. All of these have a very similar taste. They just have a different color and style to them. This is kind of the traditional culinary sage. The leaves get much bigger than the purple sage and this beautiful variegated sage, but they all have a very similar taste profile. I also saw that they had some very young bay plants in the back, which are great because these are a really great perennial here if you can put them in a kind of a windless spot because they don't like wind. But bay plants can get very large, and this is a great perennial. You can actually grow this to be an ornamental style plant where you can shape it to be a topiary and things, but this is a great size to start with, and you only need 1 or 2 leaves. And I will tell you, if you've never cooked with fresh bay leaves as opposed to dried ones, the flavor is just so different. It's lovely. And like I said, one goes one way. So I was just excited about the options that they had over here. And then we also have one of my favorite lavender plants. This is Hitticoat. And this one is one of the best edible lavender varieties. And then there was also some variegated oregano. And then there's also some Mexican oregano, which oddly enough are not necessarily the same plant. Mexican oregano is actually a little bit more in line with like lemon verbena, if you're familiar with that, but it has a little bit more of a citrus undernote with that kind of savory oregano. And this one is, again, one I really just love. And it's great when it's this season. The cool season is great for planting herbs like this because they get a little bit more tender as opposed to in the summer when they're a little bit more woody. So to get started, we're just going to put our paper in the bottom. We're going to pre-fill it with some soil so that our little seedlings have a place to land. And I just fill that kind of maybe about halfway. And then we'll take out our plants. We just gently squeeze them out of here. And then you'll see that this has really good, healthy roots. And so we just bunch them up a little bit, loosen them up. You can see some of these white roots. These are younger roots, so you'll want to be careful with those because they are the most tender and easiest to break. But we just loosen these up a little bit because we want the roots to start realizing they're no longer in their previous home. They're going to go to a new home so they can start expanding out. And then since this one has some height, I might position this one kind of here a little bit further in the back and then work down. You certainly can. You still want to look out for those white roots, but you certainly can. It's also one of those things where I will share sometimes, again, no one kind of controls how well the plants are necessarily growing or how far along they are. But one of the things you can always do is when you are searching for plants is take a look at the root structure. If a plant is too root bound, it's not going to be necessarily quite as successful. So it's like a situation with these, you want to then make sure you give those roots enough space, but it is okay to cut them out, especially if you see like a lot of dark brown or black roots. Those usually are kind of past their prime and they're not necessarily quite as healthy. So you can cut through them. You just want to make sure you don't interrupt any of those lighter color roots because those are the ones that are doing the most growing. So I love purple sage just because purple is actually one of my favorite colors to put in a garden. Purple and white are my two go-to colors. So I'm going to use a purple sage. And again, this one has really good, healthy roots. You can see lots of tender roots. So I'm just going to loosen those up a little and put that one next to it. And it's also okay if you see like there's this little one has a burnt end. It's totally okay to take and prune out any of those kind of spent leaves. You can even actually just compost them back into your soil. It's not going to be a bad thing. And then in my case, I'd probably look for something with a little bit more color. So I think I might put something like this. So I'm looking for something to create height, texture, and color. And so in this case, I'm going to use the Mexican oregano. I'm just going to prune off these couple of ones here. And I'm going to loosely open that. This guy off to the side. And then just loosely put that in there and sprinkle some of this extra soil in here. And I've just kind of created this pretty little option together. And now I know, right? These are three herbs. And so then there's obviously some extra soil in here that needs to go in. So I'm just going to loosely put that in there. Try not to make a big mess. And then we'll loosely pack this down because we don't want to necessarily root it down too much. And then the best thing that you can do to actually really get your plants kind of healthy and happy and settled, what we call, into their new home, the best is actually to water it in really well. And so again, because we have that nice sized drainage hole in here, I'm not worried about overwatering this planter because it's going to have all that it needs, right? Plus, I love planting in terracotta specifically because terracotta lets you also know how damp it is, right? Because if you've noticed when terracotta gets wet, it actually changes color, and so you'll be able to notice. And so what I like is that terracotta is breathable. It's a porous material. So again, you're not at risk of overwatering your planter. Whereas like something like this, which is a cast iron planter, it has a good sized drainage hole, but this isn't porous, right? It doesn't breathe. So using terracotta is nice because the plant roots actually get a little bit more oxygen, which is helpful. So what we then would do is just make sure that this kind of has enough soil just to cover and get those plants where they were up to their original soil line. We don't need to plant them anything underneath that. And then I just kind of level it out. And then what we would typically do is we would just water it in. And I would go you can put this on your lawn so it drains and just drains into your soil. That way, just water it in really healthy. You'll see the soil actually kind of settle and your planter is ready. So something like this to keep in mind is these hardy herbs are typically all things that like a lot more sun also. So this would be a planter that you'd want to put in a place that gets usually 6 to 8 hours of sunlight a day because that's the growing condition that they like the best. So we'll do one more planter then with some tender herbs, if you're okay with that. So again, I'm just going to fold up my little piece of paper here. This will eventually decompose, so I'm not overly worried. And about the time it actually decomposes, I'll probably replant this planter anyway. So you're not harming the environment. You're not doing anything you don't need to do. So we're going to pre-fill that with some soil. Mm-hmm. By the time it actually decomposes, you actually aren't necessarily really worried about anything coming out of the bottom of this because the roots are going to be so healthy inside that it's holding the bulk of your soil together. And so most likely what will end up happening is you'll just tip it out, and you've probably encountered that in your gardening experiences, and it'll come out all kind of clumped together, and you'll need to work those plants apart if they're still healthy, or you'll just break all that up. So I'm usually less worried by the time that actually decomposes that it's no longer serving its original function. So in this case, again, we're going to use this one for our tender herbs. And so I would probably use a couple of things that are like some of my favorites, right? So in my case, chives are something that I use in my house all the time for all sorts of dishes. And so this is a good one. This is chives typically, though, I will say they are an exception. So they are a tender herb because you eat the most tender part, obviously, frequently, but they are a perennial plant. These will continue to grow and continue to multiply over the years. And so you eventually might even have to separate them out. So in a pot like this, if this lasts, if you keep it healthy and it grows, they might end up taking over your whole plant in like a year, if that makes sense. So you'd just be able to take this out. You'd actually be able to break these up, separate them out, where again, if you wanted to cut the roots on the chives, you're not going to harm those at all. You would be able to break those apart and separate them and then put them in another planter or another pot, or actually put them in a more direct place, like directly in a garden bed or something like that. And these are great because the chives obviously have that strong onion scent to them, and they're really helpful as a pest deterrent. So we plant chives and or scallions or even onions or garlic. We plant those a lot in our what we call our salad bar beds, because a lot of aphids and things like that don't necessarily like the scent of these, and other like white flies and other things like that can sometimes bother your tender greens, like your lettuces or your spinaches. They're deterred by this. Plus, it just looks kind of pretty with a row of it sometimes just looks really pretty with like a couple rows of lettuces and then a row of onions in between them. You probably could. It actually looks like there's 3 little cells here. So when the wholesale nurseries actually grow them, they grow them in very small. I don't know if you've ever seen that. They grow them in very, very small little starter trays. I have some, and so they'll actually might grow like 100 starts in a tray. And so they just get them to a certain point. So in this case, there's actually 3 of them that got potted up here, and they usually will tease out really well. So again, you could tease this out and put this with a little bit more space. That's totally okay. Or you can leave them together. That's just fine. And then that will actually can help them grow a little bit more and multiply. And or if you want to, if you're looking, then if you were in putting these in the garden, you'd be able to separate them out, and then you'd be able to make the most out of them, right? Get them a little farther. So we've got our chives in there, and then I'm going to put some cilantro in, because cilantro is, again, one of my favorite herbs, although it is one of those that either you like it or you don't. Some people don't. Some people it tastes very soapy, and so it's just a genetic mutation, of my understanding, a genetic variation in how you like, how your taste receptors are. So again, just going to loosely put this one in. Because these have such tender roots, we're getting a lot of extra soil for a buck here. In this small little planter. And so you can see too, even in here, I think there's probably 1 or 2 little starts of those cilantro starts that are in here all together. And so in this case, I might be able to just get away with these 2 right here. And then if you want to, this is also a good opportunity for you to plant some seeds at the same time in a planter like this. Something like a cilantro, which you're going to come in and you're going to continue kind of keep harvesting, is also a really good herb. I find the tender herbs are really usually easy to grow from seed, and they have great seed selections at Orange County Farm Supply. And so you could also then just sprinkle in a couple of those seeds, and then you have kind of what we consider multiple harvests, right? Because these are going to keep growing, and then those are going to grow at a slightly slower rate. And the next thing you know, by the time these regenerate, you're going to have your seeds are going to be to a point where they can also be harvested too. And so same kind of thing. We top this off with just a little bit of extra soil, and then you can always put your plant tags back in if you're not sure what anything is. Water it in really healthy. You'll notice the soil kind of settle, and you are all set to enjoy. And so some of the other things that we might do, you might see is if we have a little extra space in a planter, I might also tuck in some pretty flowers. So like just putting in a couple of alyssum, or I think there's a pansy or a viola in the back of that one. Just adds a little extra beauty. In this case, those are all technically edible flowers also, so they go very well with our edible landscaping concept. Does anyone have any questions?
Yeah. Is tarragon hardy or
So that one is a complicated plant. So it is technically a hardy plant. It would be because it's a perennial, because it comes back every year. And usually the longer it's in, the better it gets, right? The bigger the harvest. But it does die back in our, like, right, over our summer. It doesn't usually do too well. But as long as you leave the roots and leave the space for it, it will be fine. But its herb qualities make it more of a tender plant. So when I think of it that way, it's one that needs a little bit more water, right? Rather than some of our other hardy herbs. So it's kind of a hybrid. Yeah. Yeah, sorry, Terry. Yes, tarragon. Whereas some of the other like hardier herbs that we utilize, yes. So the tarragon is a perennial. Keep it. I would plant that one in a space where, like, if you put it in a pot, you know that that's your tarragon pot, and then you know that at a certain point it's going to kind of die back. You can cut it all the way back, and then it'll regenerate. You just want to make sure you leave those roots in its place. It can, and so that's where as long as you leave the roots in and you leave just a small amount of the remaining kind of, in this case, I would cut it back to almost only be about 30% of the plant at the end of the season. It'll regenerate and it'll actually come back bigger and better. We have a couple of clients who love tarragon, and we put it on the edges of their big planters. Actually, you can probably see it maybe in a picture of this one where we talk about herbs. We put it at the edge of the planter so that, again, it's not necessarily interfering with anything, and then it drapes over it when it's in full season. And it looks beautiful. But yeah, I love tarragon. That's another one of my favorites. Any other questions? I think it's time to plant then, right?